Thank you all for being here. Thanks for your interest in hearing my views on this. I want to begin with a story. It goes back to 1958. I was a speechwriter for a U.S. senator at the time, and he asked me, to my surprise, he wanted to go to the floor of the Senate, and he wanted to give a speech defending a bill which would reduce tariffs. It was called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. And he said, I will only do this if my constituents demand it, so you're expected to get my constituents to send letters. I was a kid. I didn't know anything, so I called up some old political person in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was from there. He said, all you have to do is call up the United Auto Workers. Are you shocked? I should call the United Auto Workers to get a flood of letters to reduce tariffs. That's what I did. I called a few of the locals of the UAW, and within days, I was receiving hundreds of letters, many of them identical, written by hand, urging the senator to support the reduction in trade barriers. Now, why was that? Because in South Milwaukee, there was a huge plant producing agricultural implements, tractors and so on like that, which were being exported. The UAW had been part of the post-war accord. They knew that, yes, they would benefit from free trade, but also there was a deal, which is that they were part of an agreement whereby essentially the productivity gains associated with freer trade around the world and other advances would be shared. Now, think to today. I'll bet that many of the people that turned Wisconsin to a Republican state, first time they voted Republican in a very long time, they voted for Trump. And I'll bet that a lot of those people who wrote those letters as young people, when I was also young, and also their kids, I'll bet they voted for Trump. That's part of the reason. So what happened here? Well, liberalism is in trouble. It's not just about trade. I mean, political liberalism is in a difficult situation. I want to start with the idea that liberalism began under a government which was really a government of the rich, but it was a set of values that was advancing individual rights and tolerance as a hallmark of a well-ordered society. But it came to embrace laissez-faire economics. It places the initial values in jeopardy and has done so. In the process, liberalism lost sight of these ends that once animated it. These ends included protecting religious minorities and defending the weak against the strong. Remember, we're talking about the 17th and 18th century where governments were run by rich people. And these were rights against the state on behalf of ordinary people. Here is William Pitt describing property rights, not the way we would describe property rights today, but a way that's very important today in this world. The poorest man in his cottage bid defiance to all the forces of the crown. It may be frail, its roof may shake, the wind may enter, the rain may enter, but the King of England cannot enter. All his force dare not cross the threshold of this ruined tenement. That's property rights. Private property rights defending the weak against the strong. Adam Smith was also arguing for competition, but for what? Because what were the forces anti-competition? They were the royal monopolies. This is, of course, a famous statement that people gather together in an attempt to raise prices. This is a famous quote. Keynes wrote a wonderful pamphlet on this called The End of Laissez-Faire. I hope you all read it. And he describes this process. And I want to take you through the history from that time to this, because I want to explain how we got into the situation that we're in now. I think it may have some guidance for how we might deal with it politically and intellectually. At the end of the 17th century, Keynes wrote, the divine right of monarchs gave place to natural liberty, and the divine right of the church to the principle of toleration. The purpose of promoting the individual was to depose of monarchs and the church. The effect, through the new ethical significance attributed to contract, was to buttress property. And so here we have many examples of that. Here's buttressing property according to Smith, a remarkable sentence which follows this one, never quoted, in which Smith says, it's impossible indeed to prevent these meetings, these cartel-like things, by any law which either could be executed or would be consistent with liberty. So here's Smith introducing liberty as an argument against antitrust and competition policies, a rather remarkable statement. Here's the U.S. Supreme Court making the very obvious statement. Wherever the right of private property exists, there must and will be inequalities of fortune. It's impossible to uphold the freedom of contract and the right of private property without at the same time recognizing as legitimate these inequalities of fortune that are the necessary result of the exercise of these rights. Now, this is, again, what Keynes, exactly what Keynes is talking about. Now, he said the effect was to buttress property and to increase inequality, and we see in many of these countries an increase in the wealth share over the period from the mid-18th century until the opening of the last century. A lot of the data are from the core economics, Introduction to Economics, which you heard about yesterday from Wendy Carlin, and Wendy and I would be happy to share in emails any more information you might wish to have about that. Keynes went on rather amusingly in the following way. He said the early 19th century performed a miraculous union. It harmonized the conservative individualism with socialism and democratic egalitarianism. That age, Keynes said, would have been hard put to achieve this harmony had it not been for the economist, who sprang into prominence just at the right moment with the idea of a divine harmony between private advantage and public good. So the tension between buttressing property and the growing inequality was that we now have an argument about why this works out well for almost everybody through the process of liberty in the economy. And Keynes' conclusion is the political philosopher could retire in favor of the businessman. The latter could attain the philosopher's greatest good by just pursuing his own private profit. Now, Keynes then turns the story. The next chapter is, but it was not long before the claims of society raised themselves anew against the individual with the rise of socialism and democratic egalitarianism. So the inequality that was growing was provoking a response. And in return, the societies of Europe and also North America and a few other places, the rich in these societies conceded democracy as the price of stability. The green lines are the length of a period of democracy. The blue segments are interruptions. The pale green are periods with significant voter exclusions, for example, as in the United States, Australia, some periods in Canada. But we see there's really a massive move into the extension of the suffrage to include almost everybody, which is, of course, a necessary addition to liberalism. This is when liberalism became democratic. And this is the same graph that you saw before. I stopped it here before, and you see that during this period, I'm not saying that I know this is causal, but it is really rather striking that when the working class got the vote, there was a dramatic shift in wealth inequality in the countries we have here. It would take far more careful empirical work to establish that as causal, but I think it probably has some causal relationship. Now, I want to argue, however, that the main thrust of this equalization is not simply the fact that workers having the vote had to do with policies which favored workers. I think a really key thing about liberalism was the fact that liberalism was a form of insurance. It basically converted your situation in society to one in which the worst thing that could happen to you was not as bad as it would have been in a previous society. Think of this, a common national language, part of the liberal state. It meant that you could move from one place in the country to the other. If you lost your job here, you could probably find one there. It's hard for us to understand today that in 2 or 3 centuries ago, in most parts of the world, if you lost your job in one valley, you probably couldn't get it in the next because they spoke differently. So a common language was a kind of insurance policy. It was also true that geographical mobility being facilitated by no longer being bound in a coerced labor contract was important for the same reason. National educational systems taught us to communicate with each other in ways that were independent of our physical interaction and our common local cultures. The rule of law itself was very important in limiting the worst thing that could happen to you. Eventually, social insurance and income replacing transfers came along, but these were really quite late in the liberal history. The effect, as I say, was to limit worst-case outcomes, and what that meant was basically people were this is a kind of insurance that the rule of law and liberalism provided independently of this last thing, social insurance. By improving the fallback positions of the less well-off, that's what it did, it of course increased the bargaining power of the less well-off. And that was part of the process, which I think we see in the graph with the declining wealth inequality. Well, I want to show a couple of slides to suggest that democracy really mattered. What I've measured here is the years of democracy. That's from the previous graph with the green bars. And here we have the hours worked. A very significant relationship between how long a country's been democratic and how many hours people work. By the way, I think I've actually done diff and diff estimations on these particular countries, and you get a similar relationship. It's not simply just a gross correlation. Here's a similar one. Here we have years of democracy, and here we have the disposable income Gini coefficient. And once again, there's a pretty clear relationship. So democracy really made a difference. This is, of course, the golden age. I'm now moving up to the middle of the last century after the Second World War. The so-called Accord, which was in place when I was writing the speech for Senator Proxmire and getting the support of the UAW for free trade, that was in place, and they were counting on this, the auto workers. This is what happened afterwards. I'm sure you're familiar with the graph or something like this. There was essentially the resurgence of economic liberalism, starting much earlier than most people think, certainly by 78, or a date late in that decade. Now, this figure here from the US, it can't be matched exactly by other countries, but something similar to this was going on in a lot of countries. And I think it constituted what I called liberalism's perfect storm. We have the golden age and the resurgence of inequality. I think we're familiar with that. Associated with that was not only dashed economic expectations, the hopes that people would have the kind of life they were looking at, but the sense of loss of voice in everyday life, the absence of voice in the workplace, the decline of communities which were once whole and became broken. And these were the correlates of domestic laissez-faire. But I want to point out this. Liberalism's perfect storm, which we're now experiencing in the US, in many parts of the world, in Germany as well, it was of its own making. Global laissez-faire not only contributed to these trends towards greater inequality, it also provided wonderful scapegoats. It provided people who you could readily blame for the problem, namely people producing the imports or the immigrant living down the street. And so manufacturing workers in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, came to believe that their problem really was not their employers who were still making huge profits, but rather imports from somewhere, or the fact that there was a Somali family that had just moved in somewhere. So let's think about xenophobic intolerance. It's a symptom, not a cause, of liberalism having lost its bearings, lost its direction. That's not the reason why liberalism is failing. It's a symptom of it having failed, having forgotten that it was once an ideology and a political movement supporting the weak against the strong. And it lost its way. Now, of course, it's also true that there was a lack of a convincing account in most political spectrums, including with the exception of Bernie Sanders, including the United States. There was no account of what had gone wrong. And so, not surprisingly, people came to blame. They came to adopt intolerance or hostility towards Muslims, racism, and so on. This is a very interesting set of data. The percentage of the population which says that no Muslim should be allowed to enter. And this is the disposable income Gini. That we see a rather strong, not very significant positive relationship. I mean, we could talk all night about this graph, couldn't we? I mean, you'd want to know exactly how I measured this, but it is interesting that these highly egalitarian countries here are ones which were actually quite welcoming of Islamic immigrants compared to those there. I mean, there's some remarkable Here's a very unequal country with a very high tolerance for Muslim immigrants. Here's the same graph, and here we have years of democracy. And here we have the percentage saying no to Muslim immigrants. And once again, you see what you would expect. That is, the countries that have been democratic for a long time are relatively more tolerant than the ones who are not. I think there's something there about a history of liberalism. By the way, by now you understand I've been a socialist all my life, but I'm a great admirer of the liberal tradition for the reasons that I think now people are coming to see that, yes, it really is important what liberalism did for us. And now that we see that it's in danger, we have to think about ways of trying to expand it and make it work better. I mentioned the lack of voice, and I wanted to mention another way that the liberal tradition contributed to this problem rather than solving it. I'm quoting here from great liberals. Keynes, Robert Dahl, one of the great liberal political scientists of the last century, and my former teacher, by the way. He wrote, "An agrarian order was historically speaking an extraordinary congenial to democracy. It was now displaced by a new socioeconomic order of corporate capitalism that was much less compatible. Through a highly successful case of ideological transfer, the Lockean defense of private property, which in the agrarian order made good sense morally and politically, was shifted over intact to the corporate enterprise. Thus, by an extraordinary ideological sleight of hand, the corporation took on the legitimacy of the farmer's home and tools and land, and what he produced out of his land, labor, ingenuity, anguish, planning, forbearance, and so on." The U.S. Supreme Court says this is just an obvious point. Of course, the proprietors of the establishments and their operatives don't stand on an equality. They mean a political equality is what they're talking about. Their interests, to a certain extent, are conflicting. But here's the political inequality in the workplace. The former naturally desire to obtain as much labor as possible from their employees, while the latter are induced by fear of exchange to conform to the regulations which, in their judgment, fairly exercised, would pronounce them to be detrimental to their health or strength. By the way, the U.S. Supreme Court understood Marxism pretty well here, don't you think? I mean, this is the reserve army of the unemployed written in Supreme Court language. They'd already discovered efficiency wage theory. It took economists a long time to figure that out. In other words, the proprietors lay down the rules, and the laborers are practically constrained to obey them. This is Dahl continuing, because the internal government of the corporation was not itself democratic, but hierarchical, and often despotic. The rapid expansion of this revolutionary form of economic enterprise meant that an increasing proportion of the demos would live out their working lives and most of their daily existence, not within a democratic system, but instead within a hierarchical structure of subordination. That is the daily experience of somebody working in this situation, according to this great liberal thinker. So here's the account of how I think we got here. We got universal suffrage because the laissez-faire model generated a huge amount of inequality, which endangered the property rights and the status of the elite. Now, with the fate of the liberal values is therefore in the hands of a broad electorate, working class people. Those people and their ancestors were among those who fought hard for the extension of liberal values and of democratic rights. Today, their active support in defense of liberal freedoms, tolerance, and so on, is as important today as before. But we're not likely to get their active support because they are the victims of the model that liberalism embraced in the 18th century and the 19th century, namely laissez-faire. I think that endangered liberal values would stand a better chance in a society that was committed to defending and giving voice to the weak and the vulnerable, as did the early liberals, to ensuring democratic accountability of economic power, and to ensuring people against the insecurities that inevitably accompany a technologically dynamic and cosmopolitan economy. This is a picture of the argument as I give it to you. We've covered a lot of ground, a lot of conceptual ideas, a lot of history. But just to summarize, how much time do you have?
You could just hold 5 minutes.
Fantastic. The political liberalism here, tolerance and property rights in a society governed by the rich. It weds laissez-faire here, increased inequality as a result, demands for democracy therefore become irresistible, universal suffrage happens. This reduces inequality. This leads to, eventually, support for a neoliberal variant of this economic liberalism, which I'll discuss in the next slide. And neoliberalism, of course, supports globalism, but it also, these together, lead to increased inequality within the rich countries. And that is what gave rise, I think, substantially to xenophobic and nationalistic ideologies today, and their huge success in the political spectrum. Now, let's think about us as economists and as political actors in our world. The neoliberal success was not to demonstrate the superiority of unregulated markets. They added nothing to that, and they didn't even stress it very much. Those of you who've carefully read Hayek will know he doesn't make big claims about that. That's not a major point. Their major idea is that collective action is likely to be pathological. Collective action either in civil society by private actors or collective action by governments. If you read Buchanan, Becker, Olson, and so on, their arguments are to show that if you have selfish individuals, which of course is assumed, you either have no collective action in civil society, and you have special interest governments, or if you have collective action, it's some kind of what they call rent-seeking or special interest pathologies. So now the kinds of institutions which we rely for a decent society and civil society, such as trade unions and neighborhood associations and so on, are thought to play no role in our politics and in our societies. Now, this idea that collective action is a pathology, it was never good economics or good political science, but it's now openly contradicted by what we know from behavioral economics and the study of coordination failures. So we have something to say about this. The last 30 years of economics has been quite loud and clear that this idea of Becker, Buchanan, Olson, and so on is wrong. We could contribute to reclaiming a democratic civil society by challenging these views, the view that government is incompetent, selfish, the view that organizations in civil society are necessarily special interest groups, and so on, and including advancing the rights of workers in workplaces to have a greater voice and making economic power accountable. I want to thank the organizers of this event. It's been really great, but I'll say one thing, seeing I do have 1 minute left, don't I?
Yep.
Okay. Well, I suppressed this slide. I was identified as being from the Santa Fe Institute. Probably you know about that, but you probably don't know about CORE. So this is a new economics introduction. It's free online. Wendy Carlin discussed it yesterday. Here we have a book, but the book, you have to pay for the book, but you don't have to pay for what's in the book. It's really remarkable. It's on your telephone. All you have to do is get your telephone, and you got what's in the book. People buy the book anyway. It's great. And it's being taught in a lot of different places. It's being picked up by major universities. And because we're here in Berlin, it's been being taught in the places you wouldn't expect, the Toulouse School of Economics, for example, UCL. UCL is called Chicago on the Thames sometimes. They've taken up the course. But we're here in Berlin, so I'll leave you with this. At Humboldt University here, which is a very distinguished university, before the course began, before a single word was said, we asked, the professor of that course asked, what is the problem that economists should address? The word cloud says their answer. It's really remarkable. And it includes things you'll be happy to know about robots and digitization and globalization and so on.
In which class? In which class did you ask that question?
This is an intro class. They'd never had a word of economics. That's what they think we should be telling them about.
Michael?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.